Welcome to Democracy on Tap. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. The Kansas legislature is in session for just a few more weeks before they're scheduled to adjourn. It's been a trying year for all Kansans dealing with the pandemic, and that's also led to other health concerns as well as economic and education crises. Lawmakers have proposed some potential solutions, and some obstacles are yet to be tackled. We're going to discuss a lot of it now, but first let's meet our panel. Stephen Koranda, Statehouse reporter and news editor for the Kansas News Service. Jim McLean with the Kansas News Service. Katie Bernard is a Topeka correspondent covering the Kansas legislature for the Kansas City Star and the Wichita Eagle. And Titus Wu, state politics reporter at the Topeka Capital-Journal. We want you to join the conversation too. You can ask questions of our panel through the Facebook comments, or you can email us right now. That address is info@kmuw.org. I want to dive into some of the important health issues on the table right now, including COVID vaccine distribution and proposed legislation limiting employer vaccine requirements. Stephen, can you tell us what Kansans should expect from Senate Bill 212?
So this is a bill that would have put some limits on, for example, employers requiring their employees to have a COVID vaccine to work. It would do some other things like limit the state's ability to require the COVID vaccination for various things. But there was a big pushback against it, and eventually a large coalition, including some powerful groups like the Kansas Chamber of Commerce, formally came out against the bill and said this is taking away the power of business leaders to decide, what's best for their businesses and what requirements they can, put on their employees. So that has kind of languishing in a committee, and without getting too far in the weeds right now, the legislature is on its big, long spring break. So they wrapped up the first part of the session. They're going to come back in early May for the veto session. Well, what's called the veto session. It's really just the tail end of the session. And that typically does not last that long. So things that are still, sitting in a committee and have not come to the chamber floor yet, those are the types of things that are really facing a challenge at this point. There are always ways around the rules for something they really want. But for a bill like that, especially after it got some powerful opposition, I would expect that's not going anywhere. But it is kind of emblematic of this skepticism that some lawmakers have of the seriousness of the coronavirus and the skepticism of how important it is for everyone to get a vaccine or wear masks. If you ever, for example, watch a live stream of the floor or of a committee meeting, you'll see many lawmakers not wearing masks. So it's kind of indicative of some of the things we've seen, some of the underlying themes we've seen through the legislature.
So I kind of hear you saying that it's not very likely that it passes. Do you think that's true of a lot of the bills that haven't passed at this point, that kind of last part is mostly the doomed?
Yes, so there are technically rules in place where if a bill has not advanced by now, it's not supposed to be able to. But the joke is that nothing in the Statehouse is ever really dead. So if there's something they want at the last minute, they can cram it into a conference committee report. They can pull some little shenanigans. But for a lot of things, they're already past their expiration date.
And Sarah Jane, covered the legislature for 40 years, and it's changed a lot over the years. And in the last several years, Stephen and Katie and Titus are relatively newer there, although Stephen's a veteran. But
only 12 years.
There used to be rules against jamming stuff into those final conference committee reports. And now, at the end of the session, those things can literally be a smorgasbord of things. Like, for instance, there used to be a rule that said if something hadn't passed at least one house or the other, it couldn't be considered in a conference committee report. And they've minimized all that to the point where if it's even been mentioned once somewhere in the Statehouse, it's fair game at the end of the session. So really,
that was the big hubbub with that Gadsden flag license plate bill. It had just been popped into a conference committee report. It came to the floor, and some lawmakers were like, hey, we don't like this idea, and we never had a chance to weigh in before.
So Stephen's statement about nothing ever being dead, that's more true now than it used to be.
Very interesting. Jim, where do we stand on COVID mandates in the state of Kansas right now? Masks and gatherings and business capacity, kind of a whole picture of it.
Well, it's hard to tell. Not very firmly anywhere, I don't think. I mean, obviously, this has been a long run. This has been a battle since the beginning of the pandemic between Democratic Governor Laura Kelly and the Republican-controlled legislature, and then, of course, cities and counties and various fiefdoms all over the state. We've been all over the map on this, as has every other state and jurisdiction around the country. But as things stand now, as I understand it, and the others can weigh in, really, bottom line, the governor, the secretary of the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, and county health officers have been stripped of most of the emergency powers they had at the beginning of the pandemic. A law that took effect at the end of March nullified all of the existing executive orders related to the pandemic, and it gave the legislature the power to revoke any new ones. Now, if the legislature isn't in session, the law says a committee, which, the members of that committee are legislative leaders, which meets year round, that committee can then revoke them. Now, this is an interesting thing,
and
I
we've
think.
already seen it, Jim. What was the big example we just saw?
Well, tell me.
It was the mask mandate. When she reissued her mask mandate, lawmakers came back real quickly, shot it down. The first time they used that new law. Immediately.
I mean, a shot across the bow for sure. Now, but also, Stephen, I'm interested. The law includes an interesting section, and Titus, you wrote about this recently, aimed at discouraging local units of government, cities, counties, school districts, from imposing public health restriction. And it does that it encouraged citizens to sue if they believe the restrictions imposed by cities, counties, school districts go too far. It requires courts to conduct a hearing within 72 hours, and it goes so far as to say that the relief must be granted unless the governing body that issued the order can prove that it was narrowly tailored to protect the public health. That law's had a chilling effect, as Titus wrote about, causing some local officials to back away from mask mandates and the like, and several Republican lawmakers have said that's really what they intended to have happen. So, and again, Titus just wrote about that recently.
Yeah, Titus, what would you add?
Oh, I mean, it's a bunch of I guess I just want to add in kind of the caveat that it's still I feel this law, they call it colloquially the KMUW law, which is the stands for Kansas Emergency Management Act, revising that. It's still potentially I could see happening, when they come back for veto session, a few lawmakers probably trying to further amend and make changes to it. We saw that, toward the end of I guess the regular session, before this break, Senator Kelly Warren, who chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee, she was trying to actually kind of revise what Jim was just talking about to make it even more accessible, because it's actually, if you think about it, it sounds like, oh, wow, anybody can sue. But in reality, if you think about it, you have to kind of hire a lawyer to kind of navigate a legal process.
That has have to do that for this.
Exactly. And then also, there's been some of the governmental bodies who, kind of have been administering, I guess, the rollout of this new law. They've kind of implemented their own, I guess, kind of administrative orders in which it's kind of irked, lawmakers like Senator Warren. For instance, there was this one court in Johnson County that said that before, if you want to bring kind of a lawsuit regarding, a certain COVID-19 order, you have to, show a bunch of qualifications first, such as, that you were actually, kind of aggrieved, that, that there could be a more, narrowly tailored way to, tackle the pandemic, then the mandate that you're protesting. But the thing is, lawmakers had actually wanted to have the government prove that during the hearing, but now you have these, certain courts saying the president has to prove that.
So what Titus is saying there, again, it comes down to jurisdiction. In Johnson County, what they've done is they've come on with a layer of administrative rules and regulations that the whole point of the legislature here was to put the burden of proof on the government. And what the administrative order that he's talking about essentially puts some of that burden back on the complainant in the sense that they have to have some sort of standing like you would in a regular lawsuit. And you have to propose you have to have some sort of idea of what the remedy would be if you're complaining about something. And what Senator Warren was complaining about is, that's essentially defeating the purpose of the law, which is kind of opening the floodgates for people to come forward. But nevertheless, there have been local units of government that have said, listen, we don't want to invite any trouble. We don't want a flood of lawsuits coming our way. So any thought about extending that mask mandate, you can just forget it. And that really was, I think, a large part the intention behind the bill.
Well, and in areas,
please, Katie, go ahead.
In areas like Johnson County that did try to continue their mask mandates, these complaints aren't hypothetical. The mask mandate got shot down by lawmakers right before Easter. Before the end of the day on Friday, the Blue Valley School District already had, I think, 2 or 3 anti-mask complaints made against them and a hearing scheduled for the next Tuesday.
Yep.
And we saw before the law even took effect, Sedgwick County commissioners pointed to it as a reason to get rid of theirs.
So it doesn't, well, correct me if this is wrong, it doesn't sound like there are any COVID safety laws at the state level that are forthcoming, really.
Well, if you're talking about executive orders from the governor, she reissued a bunch of the technical ones that, for example, extend deadlines and do things like that, and lawmakers left those alone. Yeah,
it extends deadlines for, renewing licenses and that kind of thing, gives people more time. I mean, a lot of those executive orders aren't very controversial, but I think it would be fair to say, wouldn't it, Stephen, that as far as the legislature is concerned, we're at the tail end of this pandemic, and they're not really looking to do anything more to, to issue public health orders. They think we're beyond the need for those.
That's really true. And one thing we did not mention is this whole update to the Kansas Emergency Management Act was a compromise. The governor signed it because it also extended her emergency order, and that was the deal. She got her emergency declaration extended, but she had to give up even more powers. And there were some lawmakers who did not want to extend it anymore.
And that's the second or third time that's happened, where she has negotiated a deal that doesn't look like it's very good for her, just for the sake of extending an emergency order.
And
relatively soon we need to see it happen again, because
I was just going to say, is it through late May? Yeah, and I would not be surprised at all if enough lawmakers say we don't want to extend it anymore, that it just goes away at the end of May.
Mm-hmm.
So it's up to...
We'll be watching what's happening in Michigan as maybe prescient to what might be happening here.
So kind of on this track is the question of bipartisanship. And Katie, I want to come to you first on this. It's been a constant struggle with Kansas lawmakers. And let's take a listen first to this clip from Governor Kelly's State of the State address in January.
Each year in this speech, and almost every day in between, I call for bipartisanship. To work together, Democrats and Republicans have to do what's best for Kansas, to be better than what we see in Washington. We need to listen to public health experts. We need to listen to each other. We need to listen to the people of Kansas.
So, Katie, with this in mind, why is there so much friction there?
So ultimately, there have been a couple examples of, notable bipartisanship that we've seen this session. Loans put out for natural gas bills to businesses and cities following the February freeze, and a pretty major unemployment insurance reform bill. But when push comes to shove, there is a very conservative Republican supermajority in the Kansas legislature, and they don't need to act in a super bipartisan manner to get their agenda across. Their primary goal is to get a veto-proof majority on the legislation they care the most about, and then send it off to Governor Kelly and override her veto if need be.
For a little historical perspective here, you remember Governor Kelly came in at the tail end of kind of a pushback against the Governor Brownback years and the tax cuts and everything else. And for a while, prior to Governor Kelly being elected, the cycle before, there were a lot of moderate Republicans elected to the legislature, the Senate in particular. And that gave a coalition of Democrats and moderate Republican legislators some bargaining power in the legislature that they no longer have after the last election. Many of those moderate Republicans, particularly in rural areas in Hutchinson and further west, and even in Johnson County, were defeated in Republican primaries, are no longer in the Senate. And as Katie said, that gave the Republicans an even stronger majority, and they don't feel the need, frankly, to negotiate with Governor Kelly on things that they really want.
Another thing to remember is when in that clip we heard, that was the governor asking for bipartisanship when she's facing this huge Republican, supermajority in the legislature. So, yeah, it was some people would argue the person maybe on the less favorable position asking for bipartisanship.
Titus, I want to come to you next. Several bills have passed or are pending that are essentially rewriting laws to adapt to COVID. Can you give us maybe a few examples of that?
I mean, a lot of it, we kind of already talked about with kind of that huge KMUW bill, in terms of, kind of giving folks, who are, I guess, due process against certain COVID-19 orders and mandates, such as the mask mandate. I mean, there are also a few caveats, I guess, within that bill. For instance, one element of the bill, which some I guess health officers have found it to be a problem, for instance, is that for schools, for instance, they're given the sole authority to kind of restrict their operations or shut down, in response to something like the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, that's brought a lot of concerns from health officers because the school is not just like its own bubble. It's still really interconnected with other parts of the community, and if the county health officer isn't or the county government isn't able to act if there's a disease outbreak within the school, and they have to kind of rely on kind of the school board to do so. Some folks are afraid that that could cause some problems. I mean, and in terms of we talked about a lot about how the process in which now the governor's emergency orders have to be kind of approved by legislative leaders. There's also concerns about in terms of kind of the timing of it. Because before there was kind of I guess debate in terms of when we respond to the emergency, the governor's office has to act quick in certain emergencies, or else it might be too late. So there was a lot of kind of pushback into it, and I think they kind of settled on sort of a compromise where, because initially they were thinking of saying the order can't go into effect until the LCC and also the Attorney General gave kind of like a review / approval of it, but then they kind of settled on this middle ground where now it will go into effect, but then the LCC within 24 hours can come and revoke it. So I mean, those I would say are probably the main changes in response to COVID-19, along with all the stuff that we already talked about with Jim. Yeah.
Yeah, going forward, I think one of the things to keep your eye on is what happens at the county level. Every county has what they call a local county health officer. And oftentimes they're very underpaid. Oftentimes they're a physician in town or somebody like that. And they had pretty broad authority, at least initially when the pandemic struck, to issue orders at the local level. Now, the Board of County Commissioners in most counties acts as the Board of Health. And so that there's been a lot of tug of war between those county health officers and county commissions all over the state in terms of what to do in response to this pandemic. And it caused an exodus. A lot of public health people left the ranks. Public health officers just quit in frustration. And so, the next time we're dealing with something like this, it's going to be interesting to see, what level of protection we have at the local level in terms of people who really know what they're doing with public health, and whether or not we still have enough of them with enough authority and enough power to issue orders. I mean, I think that's kind of a legacy of this thing, and it's really uncertain because the law that Titus was talking about further restricts their authority. They and the governor and the Secretary of Health and Environment are now essentially serving in an advisory capacity.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I also do want to make clear though. Initially, lawmakers were thinking of kind of stripping county health officers of like kind of all authority and just only issue recommendations. But I believe the House, who was has been more quote moderate on this position. They kind of worked out with the Senate so that it's just specifically in the orders kind of regarding like masks and capacity limits that, they can't issue orders on, but they can still issue orders on for like, other types of maybe potential outbreaks and diseases. So they're still giving they still retain some power for health officers. It's just that when it comes to this COVID-19 pandemic and with masks and that type of stuff, then that's when they can't.
You're right. It is COVID specific, but nevertheless, they did reach in and restrict their power in a pretty significant way.
Very interesting. Thank you. If anyone is just joining us, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo, and this is Digital Democracy on Tap. We're talking about this Kansas legislative session with Stephen Koranda, Statehouse reporter for the Kansas News Service, Jim McLean, also with the Kansas News Service, Katie Bernard with the Kansas City Star and Wichita Eagle, and Titus Wu of the Topeka Capital-Journal. You can join the conversation by sending questions on Facebook or email them to info@kmuw.org. Stephen, now let's talk about Medicaid. How much discussion has Medicaid expansion received during this year's session?
Well, not much. I think you had on the agenda the Medicaid situation in Kansas, and the reality is there is no Medicaid situation in Kansas because we kind of have missed our best chance. Supporters of Medicaid expansion thought maybe a year or two ago they would have an agreement. They had enough lawmakers in both chambers that they could approve Medicaid expansion bills, but they would get vetoed by a Republican governor, or they just couldn't move ahead because the Republican leaders of the chambers opposed it. And that is just further hardened this year. Medicaid expansion has been one of the governor's top priorities, but the very powerful leaders in the chambers oppose it. And after the moderate Republicans, many of them lost in the last election, as we were talking about earlier, that has just further eroded a lot of the energy behind this issue. So even with the new federal legislation that offers more money to states for expanding Medicaid, it just does not look like it's going to happen. Democrats tried once or twice this year to add it as amendments to bills, and it fails. It just does not look like that's going to be happening this year. And I would think probably not next year either.
Do you believe that both sides will ever reach a compromise when it comes to this Medicaid expansion?
Boy, there's two ways to look at it. You know, we're one of the last, and so many Republican states have done it already. But on the flip side, we haven't done it yet, and lawmakers who are opposed to it are getting even more powerful in the legislature. So I would not hold my breath for Medicaid expansion unless we see a huge change in the next election.
There are things happening at the federal level that could make a difference. I mean, with the Biden administration, although those are unlikely too, in terms of making it even, giving states that haven't expanded Medicaid even a greater incentive to do so by going back to the days when the federal government picked up 100% of the costs versus ratcheting it down to where it would be now. But again, that's unlikely to happen at the federal level. But as Stephen mentioned, we're one of the few states in the country, a handful of states really, that have not taken advantage of this or have not expanded Medicaid. And yet, what President Biden has done too is he's expanded the enrollment period for Obamacare and on a lot of other things to mitigate the effect of that. But I would agree with Stephen. I think it looks unlikely, at least in the immediate future.
Well, and with those, federal incentives that have been offered at this point, even as recently as last week or the week before that, the House Majority Leader compared, taking the incentives to expand Medicaid and using that now as, the first hit of a drug. That was the comparison that he put to it, very antagonistic terms. Even with a huge chunk of change, there's just absolutely no interest from the Kansas Republicans at this point.
He's talking about Representative Dan Hawkins, who's the majority leader in the Kansas House. And it bears mentioning, particularly in this forum, that he's from Wichita. And he's been really the most steadfast opponent to Medicaid expansion from the very beginning. So I think, and he's got his reasons, but I think it's important to identify that he has been one of the main opponents, and he's succeeded in keeping it bottled up for several years.
Mm-hmm. Do you think if the Republican representation came back to more moderates in coming years, that would make a big difference, or how?
That's
I don't
what
know.
Stephen was talking about before. They actually passed Medicaid expansion. Governor Brownback vetoed it, and then they came very close. And it would have passed in other times when moderates had and the Democratic coalition existed, except then
the conservative leaders have so much power to create the agenda. If the leaders of the chamber are opposed, it's very, very hard to get it, even if a majority of members of the chamber want it.
Ironically, poll after poll suggests this is very popular with Kansas voters. I don't know what the latest numbers are, but 60, 70, 80%. I mean, it's been, and yet it doesn't move in the legislature. That also, I think, is interesting that things like this can be poll so well and still the leadership can succeed in taking no action on them whatsoever.
The Kansas economy has been a significant focus this year's session, including distribution of the shuttered venue grants. Here's the president of the Orpheum, Diana Gordon, talking about how venues trigger more economic impact than just from their own ticket sales. And Titus, I want to hear from you on the other side of this clip.
Because, before they come here, they go eat at a restaurant, or afterward they go over to Old Town and have a drink. And, we're part of that pipeline, that economic pipeline.
So about that economic pipeline, and Titus, can you tell us about the state's plans to kind of help local businesses?
Yeah, so that's probably going to be one of the bigger topics that, when they come back in May, that's something that they have to address. I guess for quick background, before the legislative session, there was actually, I believe it was a Wichita gym that sued the state, saying that, under the provisions of that KMUW bill that we just talked about, that, they're actually entitled to compensation because, the state shut them down and that hurt them. And, a similar argument is also being brought forth in front of, county governments across Kansas. And in general, most of the, politicians and the legislature and even the state general, on principle, they kind of agree with that. And then what they agreed to do is that they would pause that lawsuit, and during session, they would figure something out. So, it's in the break right now. So they haven't come up with like a final conclusion in between January and end of April. But they're currently looking at kind of, I guess, there's two, I think, pathways that they're looking at that I think both might pass when they come back in May. One of them is kind of this kind of a process through the Attorney General's office to kind of resolve kind of the legal liability that the state and other governments have, which would basically, I believe, it would ask every county and also the state to set aside a portion of the money that's, that doesn't have any kind of strings attached to it from the federal government, a portion of it to be set aside to specifically, compensate businesses who are hurt by some of these restrictions or shutdowns. And then the state attorney general would have this kind of process to kind of, go through each and every claim that, a business can submit for. And then, then they would issue kind of a certificate to that business saying, all right, you're entitled to this amount of money. And they could go to the state government or the local or the county government to get that money. Again, businesses, they don't want to like just continue suing the state for it because, the laws cost money. They rather, have a process in place, right, where it would be, more efficient to get that money, to get that relief, and less expensive as well. And that just also helps the state in terms of kind of the legal liability that they have. Lawmakers are also looking at kind of providing kind of property tax relief, because, the argument is that, if the government is preventing you from, using your property to conduct your business, right, that you should be owed some of that property tax relief. And currently, the legislation they're looking at right now is structured kind of in which the state gives a portion and the county gives a portion of kind of that reimbursement. And in that portion, that money would also rely on kind of the federal coronavirus relief funds coming in from the American Rescue Act plan that Congress just recently passed. So, a big reason why they're kind of pushing this off until May is because they're maybe hoping that, there'll be more clear guidance from the U.S. Treasury in terms of, how that coronavirus relief money could be used, because, oftentimes, there's always these guidances. So then they also don't know how much money exactly is going to be left. Like, what's that pot of money available for these businesses hurt by these COVID restrictions to get that money for the compensation. So that's going to be a big, thing they're going to be looking at. They're definitely going to get it passed, because if they don't get it passed, they're going to face, Kansas is going to face a wave of lawsuits. County governments will face a wave of lawsuits over it. And it's also being backed by the Kansas Chamber, which is, very powerful. So there will be something that should come out, before the end of May on that.
Probably not one of the doomed ones then.
Yeah.
Thank you, Titus. I want to back up real quickly here to an audience question. This is a listener question from Facebook. Larry asks, would Medicaid expansion save rural hospitals in Kansas?
Well, Katie mentioned Dan Hawkins. Dan Hawkins is adamant that it would do nothing to help rural hospitals. And of course, the people advocating for Medicaid expansion say that's not true. Really, most rural hospitals depend more on Medicare than they do on Medicaid because of aging populations. And yet, in a lot of parts of the state, Medicaid is a really important revenue stream, and there's some evidence that Medicaid expansion would provide coverage to people in rural areas who don't have it. And so, yes, I think a fair look at the issue would say it would help rural hospitals, and there are many of them in Kansas that are struggling. Whether or not it would save those that are at death's door, I think is questionable, but it would be an additional revenue stream for these hospitals.
Katie, do you know what his argument was that it would not do anything? Do you know what the reasoning was behind it?
To be quite honest, this has been my first session at the Statehouse, and with Medicaid expansion being fairly dead on arrival, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
His argument is that rural hospitals depend more on Medicare than Medicaid, and that Medicare rates were cut in part to fund Obamacare. Therefore, it's a little bit, he just says, he just kind of states that. And he thinks Medicaid expansion, again, as Katie indicated before, while there are a lot of incentives, he thinks it's, and he's one of those who contends that Medicaid expansion would cost more than proponents say it would to the state. And so you put all that together, he just thinks it's a fool's errand. I think there's plenty of evidence on the other side, but the debate continues.
And that's been the argument with these incentives, is even if you get the incentives now, down the line, the state will need to pay for Medicaid expansion.
So, Katie, tell us more about the education legislation from this session so far. That's another big thing that we really haven't talked about yet this evening.
Yeah, so education may have arguably been the biggest piece of drama from the last week of the session last week. The House put together this pretty massive package that tied funding of the schools for the next year to
which is
some
billions and billions of
dollars. To some expansion of an existing like tax credit scholarship program, creation of a new voucher-like program. It's not exactly vouchers, but it would work in a similar manner. And new restrictions on future remote learning. Can
you describe the vouchers? I'm sorry, for anyone who,
Yeah. So basically the new program that it was seeking to create was called education savings accounts. And for any student deemed at risk, and there was a list of qualifications for that student's family would be able to pull the amount of base aid that the state would spend to educate that child. And rather than going to public school and spending it that way, they could spend the money on private school and other like pre-approved educational expenditures. And so that obviously had some really steep opposition from Democrats and from some moderate Republicans who saw it as pulling public dollars to private schools. It barely squeaked by in the House and fell on a 20-20 vote in the Senate on the last day of the session. So at this point, the state of play is all of those policies. We're not really sure where they're going to go. The legislature needs to find a way to fund the schools before they go home for the session. And it's a little bit uncertain at this point whether lawmakers are going to try to tie in some of those same policy measures or just get the schools funded and try again next year. The Senate Education Chair, Molly Baumgardner, indicated that she would like to just, fund the schools and maybe go after some smaller policy changes. And the House Education Funding Chair, Christy Williams, who is from Augusta, told me on Friday that she wouldn't support any funding of the schools without policy measures attached. So
the whole strategy here is all these controversial policies Katie was talking about. The strategy here is you mix them in a bill with the billions of dollars of funding for the schools. Then if you can get it approved and send it to the governor, you say, okay, governor, here's the package. You got to either veto school funding because you oppose these school voucher programs, as critics would call them, or you have to accept our school choice programs to get your school funding. It didn't work that way. So that's why we're back to, is it going to be again school funding mixed with policy issues, maybe to try to get them past the governor, or are we just going to have the school funding by itself? That's what we're kind of really waiting to see.
And remember, there's a huge long-running controversy about funding for public schools behind all of this anyway. We just figuratively got over the hump in terms of, there had been years and years, decades of litigation over whether the funding was adequate. And finally, during the Kelly administration, with some bipartisan agreement with former Senate Majority Leader Jim Denning, they got the money that finally got the court to kind of back off and said, yes, for now, it looks like you're funding schools adequately. Well, this complicates all of that again. And if there was one issue that stood above all others in the last gubernatorial campaign, at least as far as Governor Kelly is concerned, it was school funding. And so if she's going to draw the line anywhere, it's going to be on this issue, I think.
It'll be a huge fight.
So what comes after this break is it's either the doomed bills or the most contentious, biggest deal.
Right. And that's where the timing thing comes in. If Senate President Masterson really wants to wrap this up in a couple of weeks, Christy Williams may not get her way in terms of peppering that bill with a lot of controversial things, because they'll have to at some point just decide that they're going to pass whatever they have to pass and then get out of there. And every time you throw in one of those controversial issues, it potentially, throws a snag into things and delays their ability to get out of town.
But that can also be the strategy, Jim. You pass the controversial bill, then you leave and say if the governor vetoes it, she has to call a special session, and maybe that would make her look bad.
Mm-hmm. Now, Katie, what is going on with the most recent LGBTQ legislation?
So at this point, there were two major LGBTQ bills introduced this session. One dealt with hormone care for transgender youth and was dead on arrival. It never received a hearing. It never had a debate. It didn't go anywhere. The other is the legislation that would ban transgender students from girls and women's K-12 and college sports. That passed the Senate, I think, last month, but was initially never brought up in the House. Through a procedural move, it was brought back to life. In the last week of the session, it was stuffed into a conference committee report, as Stephen mentioned earlier, and it passed through both chambers and is headed to the governor's desk. It didn't have a veto-proof majority, so while the governor hasn't said what she thinks about it, she's had a pretty vocal record of being in favor of LGBTQ rights in the state. So it would be a surprise to see her sign it.
Yesterday, the Kansas News Service actually had a story on this. Brian Grimmett, one of the reporters in Wichita, went to an event with the governor and specifically asked her about it. Governor Kelly will never say she's going to veto a bill until she vetoes it. So she did not say that, but she roundly criticized the bill and called it a, quote, I think she said, quote, job killer. So from her perspective, she has criticized it enough that I think it's probably a safe bet she's going to veto it. But
particularly, as Katie mentioned, if the initial vote suggests she has a veto-proof majority, I think that suggests that she will take out the veto pen on this one.
Very interesting. Nancy from Facebook asks, if Kansas Republicans aren't representing their constituents, who are they representing? I think she might be referencing,
Well, they are representing their constituents. That's the issue. There's a huge urban-rural divide in this state, and it's always been there, but it's now more complicated than it's ever been. It's not just geography; it's cultural war issues and a lot of other things. And so they technically are representing their constituents.
Sometimes those constituents are the people who elected them in the Republican primary.
Correct.
That's part of the primary process.
That's right.
On both sides of the aisles, kind of only the diehards in the party usually show up.
Functionally, here's the dilemma. Democrats really, when I first started covering the legislature many years ago, you would see Democrats elected from Hayes, from Dodge City, from all over the state. That doesn't happen much anymore. And so the Republican primary in a lot of these legislative races is the race. And whoever comes out of that primary is going to be and typically the more conservative the candidate, particularly in rural areas, is winning those primaries. And so there's a functional reality to this. And so it gets pretty complicated, but I think it would be fair to say, and I'm not sure there's any study that documents this, but I think it would be fair to say that the Kansas legislature right now is probably a little bit more conservative than the public at large, but it still breaks down district by district.
Very interesting. Jim, debates over voting laws have also gripped the nation and the state of Kansas. Are new voting requirements likely to pass in Kansas?
Well, some already have, and I'd like the others to weigh in on this, but as you mentioned, the New York Times reported that there have been more than 300 bills introduced across the country in state houses across the country to affect voting laws one way or another after this last controversial election. The new law here in Kansas doesn't go as far as many would. I mean, it really is pretty tame by comparison. Nevertheless, it seeks to prevent what people call ballot harvesting, which is really more of a theoretical problem than a real problem in Kansas and elsewhere. But It limits the number of ballots that any person can deliver to an election office on someone else's behalf to 10. Senate President Ty Masterson says, yeah, there may not be a problem right now, but he wants to prevent future abuse. There's another bill that's still pending that hasn't passed. It's sitting around in a committee that would somehow affect the schedule. You know, it was very controversial in the last election as to when mail-in ballots could arrive at the election office. And right now in Kansas, as long as it's postmarked by Election Day, it can take up to 3 days to get there and it will still be counted. Well, there's a bill
which is a recent change. They only did that a few years ago.
Yeah.
It used to have to be in the hands of the election official by the end of Election Day.
Well, and the bill would put it back to that, the bill
Yep.
that's pending. And I don't know, maybe Katie and Stephen and Titus know more about, you know, what lies ahead for that bill in the veto session. But right now it's still in committee, and that bill would put it back to mail-in ballots would have to arrive by no later than 7 p.m. on Election Day to be counted. Interestingly, I just, when I was researching this, there was a bill that was introduced in January by Representative Boog Heiberger of Lawrence, he's a Democrat, that would sign Kansas onto an interstate compact agreement to bypass the Electoral College and require essentially the president of the United States to be elected by popular vote. That bill was sent to committee as soon as it was introduced, and not surprisingly, it hasn't budged. So I just thought it was interesting that that was because you heard a lot of people, you know, talking about the Electoral College in the wake of the last election. But so far, I wouldn't call, again, opponents of these bills see everything in regard to changes of election law as voter suppression, while the proponents say, listen, we just want to restore confidence in the electoral process, and we want to tighten it up a little bit. And so that's the state of play right now.
Sarah Jane, I find it hard to believe we have not had any questions about marijuana. Why don't you just queue up the marijuana questions now? Let's get right to it.
I do have another audience question here, but it's not about marijuana either.
Even hijacking the proceedings. That's okay.
Well, you probably have marijuana on your chat filter, so anyone who mentions it, it's automatically removed.
Stephen, why don't you go ahead and share what your thoughts are on the inclusion of marijuana in...
Marijuana, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, the reason I brought it up is because this year we saw it get as far as we ever have. You know, we talked about being one of the states that hasn't expanded Medicaid, but if you look at medical marijuana, we're one of, I think, 3 that has not legalized some form of medical marijuana. It's to the point now where even conservative Republicans are pushing the idea. And this year they built a bill by like plucking little bits of policies that other states have tried. They took a lot from Ohio that approved a medical marijuana law a couple years ago. And they built in a Republican committee a medical marijuana bill and passed it out of the committee. Now it's been pushed back into the committee for more work. But it's really started to look like this is an issue that even with conservative Republicans is getting some traction.
Again, another issue that a majority of Kansans favor.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to ask what a timeline for this would be. But yeah, Katie, go ahead.
I mean, timeline-wise, I think it's kind of anyone's game. But some of the snags that at least I've seen coming up is there is a consensus of people wanting a medical marijuana policy within the legislature, but it's the question of what it looks like. Democrats are seeking a pretty open policy that is, you know, limiting restrictions to access, whereas Republicans are seeking to model the policy off of Ohio, which is one of the nation's most restrictive, that has, you know, a lot of barriers to entry to ensure that people aren't just, you know, saying they need medical marijuana when they just want recreational marijuana.
And also limits on, you know, the number of dispensaries and things like that. And you were right, we had taken a lot from the Ohio law, and but they actually loosened it up a little bit in committee. They had taken the Ohio law, and then they added a really strict provision that they plucked from the New Jersey law. But the New Jersey law had some exceptions, and the original bill that they had in committee said you had to go to a specially licensed doctor, and you had to be with that doctor for a year before that doctor could recommend marijuana to you. And a lot of people thought that was too strict, so they actually pared that back. But yeah, Katie's exactly right. They've been taking really conservative policies and building something, because Senate President Ty Masterson, I interviewed him about this, and he told me jokingly, you know, we don't have that many 18-year-olds with glaucoma who need to smoke marijuana. So his perspective was it needs to be really strict, so it's limited to people who can really legitimately benefit.
The trick will be finding a balance that can get support from both sides.
Do they have time to find that balance, or maybe maybe there are negotiations going behind the scenes and they're closing in on it, and that's something that will pop out rather unexpectedly in the veto session?
That will be interesting to watch. Thank you. The other thing that I'm surprised didn't come up from an audience question is the Swalentrop situation. Will you kind of give a summary? A Swalentrop situation. Give a summary of that, and will he be removed? Kind of your best guess for what's coming down the pipe.
You had some audio clips. Do you have the 911 tape? No,
I don't have it handy, but that would be interesting to include.
It is interesting listening. Driving the wrong way on Interstate 70 for a while, and people calling into 911. It was interesting.
I feel like I've blabbed enough, so why don't one of you, who have also covered this a lot, outline it? Katie, you were there on Friday.
In.
I was going to say you sat outside that committee with me and other reporters.
So this has been going on for about a month now.
Let's tell people who Gene Swalentrop is.
Yes. Gene Swalentrop, senator from Wichita, was the Kansas Senate Majority Leader.
Very powerful position.
Comes with some additional pay, and you know the biggest piece of his position to be aware of is that he sets the agenda for what gets debated on what days. He has a large amount of control over what the Senate will even consider. On March 16th, I believe it was a Tuesday morning, he was arrested after having allegedly driven the wrong way on Interstate 470 and then I-70 in Topeka, and fleeing from police when they attempted to pull him over. He was formally charged for these, both a felony fleeing and eluding charge, a couple misdemeanor driving under the influence charge, and then a couple traffic infractions about 2 weeks ago. And then the kind of most recent development was when the affidavit in his case was released this past week that revealed—
was the last straw.
The arrest affidavit, right? That's
correct. Yeah. It's basically the document that the Capitol Police officer who arrested him wrote, explaining to prosecutors why he should be charged.
And explaining that Swalentrop called the officer Donut Boy and said he could beat the officer in a fight, and that his blood alcohol content was twice the legal limit. Those were a lot
about 3 hours after the arrest, his blood alcohol level was twice the legal limit. So with those revelations out, his colleagues gathered on Friday evening and voted to remove him from the leadership position. But he remains a senator. So theoretically, he will be back in May with the rest of them, though it will potentially be a bit of an awkward situation for all involved.
I would think so. So is he just there until, people vote him out in this, the next election, or?
Well, he's a rank and file senator now. And the answer is we don't know. I mean, I looked up his district today. It's a very conservative district. In the last election, he won 66 to 33. He got 2/3 of the vote. So he could be voted out. There are processes for recalling legislators, but they seem like probably a long shot. That'd be very, very unusual.
Granted, he is also charged with a felony, and if convicted, he would not legally be able to vote in the Senate anymore, and it's questionable whether he would legally be able to serve in the Senate.
Very interesting. Well, that's something else to watch. I have a couple of audience questions here from Facebook I want to get in before we run out of time. The legislature is required to pass a balanced budget. Do the proposed tax cuts throw the budget out of balance? And if so, what is likely to happen on Medicaid and other specific issues?
Well, we got that sweet COVID aid. The question now is, can you use this federal coronavirus aid to balance the budget while you're also cutting taxes? There's a lot of questions about how this federal money can be used. For example, some lawmakers want to not fully fund K-12 education and say, well, use some of the COVID aid you got to round out your budget. We don't know if the state can do that. There's really a lot up in the air, but federal aid is helping lessen the budget's problems here in Kansas, and that is kind of what is enticing people to look at tax.
This can get real technical real fast, but let's just cut to the bottom line. The requirement that Kansas have a balanced budget is not a mere legal statutory requirement. It's constitutional. I mean, Kansas cannot operate. I mean, the legislature and the governor would be violating the Constitution if they passed a budget that they weren't sure was balanced in terms of use of the federal money. I mean, I think it's ironic that Republicans in Washington, D.C. were fighting against allowing state and local governments to use COVID relief money to fill holes in the budget. And yet you have people here in Kansas in the Republican Party who want to use that money to fill holes in the budget created potentially by tax cuts. And say, anyway, at the end of the day, they have to pass a balanced budget one way or the other. It has to balance at least on paper.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there a stipulation in that, in that federal bill saying that you can't use that relief money to, at least directly fill those?
Yeah. You can't. If there's a hole in the budget, you can't. But you can spend it on things that free up money elsewhere, then that can be diverted to fill any hole in the budget. I mean, you can circumvent that in certain ways.
Titus, you're exactly right. It's a sticky situation because there are those requirements, like you mentioned, Titus. But then it's like Jim was saying, are there ways around them? It's what's something that's complicated as a state budget. There are a lot of ways to move things around.
I do believe there's also a lawsuit currently going on. I believe the Attorney General, Derek Schmidt here, has also joined that lawsuit, kind of challenging that provision in court, saying that, it violates kind of the state's rights to kind of, determine their own, I guess, tax policies and everything. So that's also something to watch.
It definitely
irony
is.
There too.
I have a question here from Larry on Facebook. Will the new voting laws in Kansas also affect NCAA basketball tournament events in Kansas?
The biggest risk to those appears to be the trans athletes bill. I have not heard anything that severe on the voting laws, but Kansas is the trans athletes bill that they passed is mirroring ones passed in other states, and the NCAA came out with a very clear statement yesterday saying we select states for tournaments and things like that do not support discrimination. And so it made us think, we have NCAA tournaments in Wichita in 2022 and 2025. Are those in danger? We kind of don't know at this point.
What's interesting about that trans bill, the trans law now, is how those things arrive at state capitals across the country. That's model legislation that, as Stephen and Katie both mentioned, has been under consideration, essentially the same legislation across the country, particularly in Republican-controlled states. It's no accident that it's happening here and across the country. They're making a statement, again, on one of these quote-unquote culture war issues. And it's interesting to see how widespread something like that can become very quickly in terms of passing these kinds of laws. And frankly, Senator Roger Marshall, Kansas's new U.S. senator, is pushing very similar legislation at the federal level.
Well, thank you all so much for such a wonderful discussion. I think that was really informative, and certainly there's some unanswered questions. We'll have to wait and see what happens here. I hope that all of you enjoyed our discussion as well. You can watch this conversation on our website under the events tab at kmuw.org. This Digital Democracy on Tap conversation is sponsored by Susan and Leon Mader of Mader and Associates. For KMUW, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo.
Thank you.